Welcome all viewers to our channel. We are glad to see you here, where we share amazing stories from people's lives. Each of you is important to us and we will be interested to know what country and city you are from. Please write about it in the comments. Now let's move on to our first story. Evening was descending on the city. The bright lights of advertising signs and the neon lights of stores enlivened the streets, immersed in the bustle of a large metropolis. In the center of the city, a tall man in modest but neat clothes stood on one of the streets. His face reflected a concentrated calmness. He didn't seem to be interested in the people around him, but his attention was drawn to the tall buildings and the noise of cars, as if he were used to other sights and sounds. A patrol car was passing nearby, and one of the policemen glanced in the direction of the passerby. Suddenly tense, his colleague, noticing this, squinted, assessing the man, who seemed to look out of place on the street. The policemen looked at each other, and one of them remarked loudly, "Damn it! Look at that weird guy. He looks like he's in charge. Maybe he's waiting for someone, or is he going to cause trouble?" The other officer only snorted, but something in his colleague's tone caught him, and he slowly slowed the car down, watching the stranger. The passerby's gaze was too calm and confident, as if he didn't think he was guilty of anything and was sure of his right to be here, and that irritated them. "Let's check him out," said the first policeman quietly. There was irritation inside him, mixed with a vague anxiety, and he felt a rush of vague discontent. All too often such men had been found innocent and got away with it. This time he was in a different mood. He wanted to teach all these, as he said to himself, arrogant and suspicious types a lesson. The car turned on its blinkers and turned to the sidewalk. The man, noticing the stopped patrol, smiled faintly, as if he had foreseen the development of events, but something in his gaze remained as calm and unperturbed, which began to anger the cops even more. One of them got out of the car and walked resolutely toward the passerby, already anticipating the feeling of power. "Hey, stop! Show me your ID!" The officer sharply addressed him, hardly hiding his irritation. The man slowly looked up, breaking away from his thoughts, and smiled slightly, squinting his eyes. "What are the grounds for the inspection?" he asked calmly, as if he were not just a passerby, but a man accustomed to other rules of communication. His voice was low and firm. The policeman frowned in response. This did not suit him. Something inside him exploded. How could this man, in spite of the patrolman, in the very center of the city, show such fearlessness and calmness? "You don't need my grounds," the policeman said in a harsh tone as he came closer. "Show me your papers, and maybe we'll part quickly. Or would you prefer it another way?" But the man took a step back without averting his gaze, sensing that the situation might get out of hand. When the man took a step back, it was as if some invisible signal flashed at the police officers. His calm and confident demeanor angered them even more. In the eyes of the officers, he became not just suspicious, but defiantly dangerous. They exchanged glances, not saying a word, but already understanding each other without words. They were not going to let him go so easily. The two policemen, Mike and Tom, had known each other for years and were used to working in tandem. The atmosphere in their small station had long been dominated by certain attitudes and prejudices. They often patrolled the poorer parts of the city and over the years had grown accustomed to considering those who were different in skin color or looked different from those they considered their own as suspicious. Mike, a senior officer, loved to argue that criminals are easy to read by their looks and behavior, and now he was sure that he had just such a criminal in front of him. "Are you hiding something?" Mike said defiantly, looming over the man and adding sarcasm to his tone. His gaze glittered with an unpleasant coldness. "Thought we'd just drive by?" "Wrong, buddy." The man didn't move, only his jaw tensed, but his voice remained the same, calm and firm. "I'm not your friend, and I have nothing to show you. You haven't shown any reason to check me out. If you want my identity, I'll just give you my name." Those words seemed to ignite a fire of resentment in Mike. He was used to unconditional obedience, and he would not tolerate even the slightest insolence from this stranger. The cops knew they had power and impunity behind them, and their stereotypical attitudes flashed through his mind. Do you think you're smart? You think you can set conditions? Tom, standing a little behind Mike, was already groping the weapon, as if by the way, and his gaze was growing more and more dangerous. You're in the wrong place, friend. The man met their gazes again with icy calm. There was no fear or defiance in his demeanor. It seemed as if he already knew how all this would end, but his calmness irritated the policemen so much that every silent look and gesture seemed more and more defiant. They did not know who he was. They could not even imagine that he was a general who had been through combat and many difficult situations in which hundreds of lives depended on his decisions. To them, he was just another suspicious passerby who decided to go against their orders. Mike made a sign to Tom, and they both moved closer to the man, at the same time starting to search his pockets. The man didn't resist, but remained cold and silent, which only fueled their aggression. We've got a stubborn one here. Tom grinned, searching the man and finding nothing but business cards and keys. But the man's lack of response was getting them more and more pissed off. Well, since you've decided to keep quiet, you're coming with us, Mike announced, handcuffing him. The man sighed quietly, as if he'd anticipated that this wasn't going to be a conversation. As the police handcuffed him, passers-by looked around furtively, and some even pulled out their cell phones to take pictures of what was happening. Mike and Tom seemed oblivious to the attention from outside. Their targets stood before them, restrained and, they were sure, unable to resist. They pushed the man toward the patrol car, intending to search him even more thoroughly and get the answers they thought he was hiding. So, you're going to tell us everything, Mike said mockingly, opening the back door of the patrol car and sitting the man inside, slamming him roughly against the metal edge. But the man didn't even flinch, just stared at Mike with a cold disdain that made the officer feel a sudden flash of irritation and anger. You got your papers on you? Or did you leave them at home on purpose, knowing that we have an eye for your kind? Tom grinned, putting his foot on his leg as he sat down next to the man in the car. You think we don't realize you're hiding something? The man slowly turned his head and looked calmly at the officers again, equalizing his breathing and holding back his growing indignation. I have already said, he began in a quiet but confident voice, if you want to know my name, you have the right to ask, but what gives you a reason to treat me so? I have done nothing wrong, and your demands and manners are just rudeness. The man's words, instead of calming them down, fueled their anger. In the eyes of the officers, he had not just failed to comply with their demands, he had dared to criticize their actions, questioning their authority and right to control. Who the hell are you? You must be the kind of guy who thinks he can talk to us as equals? Mike, raising his voice, leaned closer to the man. You should be grateful to all of us that we keep this town safe, and that you're allowed to walk around here without much trouble at all. You seem to have an inflated ego. But the man didn't look away. His face was a mixture of contempt and determination, as if he wanted to say something that would break them, but held back, realizing that his words would only exacerbate the situation. The silence, however, acted as a provocation to the police. You're just used to being talked to like that, aren't you? You think we're gonna be scared of that look in your eyes? You're just a suspect. And, believe me, Tom grinned, the more you play the silent hero, the worse it's going to be for you. I don't think you realize what you're doing, the man said at last, not hiding his cold certainty. If you knew who I was, maybe you'd have a little more respect. For a moment Mike and Tom glanced over, and something like confusion flashed in their eyes, but then they quickly returned their smug masks. Oh, we realize you're a big shot. But we're not afraid of that. We've dealt with people like you, and we know how to handle them, Mike snapped. And the longer you try to look tough, the longer you'll be here. With these words, he opened the car door and pulled the man outside, intending to continue the interrogation in public. The man was still calm, but he could see the fire of growing anger in his eyes. As the police pulled the man out of the car, Mike pushed him again so that his back was pressed against the hood of the patrol car. The passers-by around them stopped again, some of them taking pictures on their phones, discussing and whispering among themselves. The man tensed, turned around to free himself from the officer's grasp, and spoke in a low, firm voice. "You have no right to treat me like this. It's unprofessional and illegal. Show me immediately the reason for your detention." Mike and Tom froze when they heard him say those words. His tone was commanding and stern, and there was something in it that would have made many people think. But the policemen saw it only as a challenge. They felt that control of the situation was slipping out of their hands, that this man did not fit their usual patterns, did not obey as detainees usually did. He was overconfident, and that made them angry. "Do you really want to know what grounds we have?" Mike leaned closer and gritted his teeth. His face was twisted with anger, and he spoke so that only the man could hear him. "The grounds are that you took a bad look at us, started fucking around, and that's more than enough for us." "I haven't broken any law," the man said coldly, not taking his eyes off him. "What you're doing is an abuse of power. You have a duty to behave like a police officer, not a thug." The man's words sounded louder than he probably intended, and some of the people around him began to whisper, indignantly discussing the officer's behavior. A few people were already clearly dialing the emergency services to report what was happening, but the police, enraged by his words, did not notice it. All their attention was on the man. Tom, losing all patience, shoved the man with such force that he almost lost his balance, but he straightened up immediately, holding his ground. There was a faint shadow of anger on his face, restrained but so powerful that even the policeman felt a slight fear. But the fear was quickly replaced by rage. "What? You think you can run this place? You think your clever speeches are going to stop us?" Tom raised his voice, not caring that the cameras were rolling. He grabbed the man's shoulder, squeezing it so hard his knuckles turned white. "We have our own ways of dealing with people like you. Unless you want to face serious consequences, I advise you to stop," the man said quietly but firmly. "Your actions are illegal, and you will be held accountable for them." "Oh, that's how it is, huh? You're going to teach us how to work?" Mike grinned with such malice that his face contorted. "Let's see who's in charge here. You're acting like a little rebel, and I'm going to have to explain to you how real men behave." With those words, Mike pushed the man harder, hoping that he would finally give in and give in to them, show some fear. But the man didn't even falter. He looked at them as if deciding how best to proceed. His gaze remained impenetrable, and there seemed to be a threat in it. This unshakable certainty was like a knife in their backs. They did not understand why this man was not afraid of them, and it irritated them to the extreme. They were ready to do anything to make him obey. Mike snatched the baton, contempt written all over his face, and he whispered through clenched teeth, "Now we're going to explain to you what it means to disrespect the police." Tom nodded and stepped forward, preparing to support his partner. The man remained calm, but his gaze hardened. "You're making a huge mistake," he said, looking straight into Mike's eyes. "It's a mistake you can't hide." Without waiting for a response, Mike struck the man hard on the shoulder with his baton, causing him to sway for a moment. The crowd around him shuddered. Some shouted. Others began to demand the police to stop. But the officers remained indifferent to what was happening. They felt that their power was unlimited, and this man's insubordination was an insult they could not tolerate. "Get on your knees," Tom shouted, grabbing the man's hands roughly and pulling them behind his back. But the man did not move. He stood straight, showing neither fear nor pain, his gaze cold and penetrating, as if he were tormented not by the physical blows, but by the fact of this humiliation. "I am an army general," he said clearly, each word making the police officers freeze in surprise. "My identity is confirmed by documents that you didn't even try to check." His words hung in the air, and the crowd around him began to whisper louder and louder. The cops stalled for a moment, glancing at him, but only for a second. They didn't believe him and thought it was just another trick. "You can call yourself president," Mike snorted, delivering another blow with his baton. "But as long as you're on the street, you obey our rules. And if you resist the officers, you won't see the street again until morning." Tom pulled out the handcuffs and snapped them on the man's wrists with a sharp snap, so hard that the metal dug into his skin. Even then, the man didn't show any sign of feeling pain. He straightened up as far as the cuffs would allow and looked at them with an expression that read contempt and judgment. "I repeat," he said firmly, not looking at the crowd around him, only at the two policemen, "you are making a grave mistake. Your actions are illegal, and you will be held accountable for them. I demand that you give me an opportunity to explain myself and show me my documents." "Are you demanding?" Tom snorted, his face contorted with anger and contempt. "You make demands when you're asked. Understand? You're nothing here. Just another insolent bastard who's decided to show us his character. Go on. Go on. Let's see how much courage you have when we get to the station." The man tried to speak again, but Mike yanked him sharply by the shoulder, forcing him to shut up. The officers roughly led him to the patrol car, pushing and holding him by the handcuffs as if he were a dangerous criminal. The man walked without resisting, but there was something dark and angry in his eyes, and the officers instinctively sensed that his silence now threatened them far more than if he had shouted or insulted them. The crowd was watching, whispering excitedly, some calling the police or control services, reporting lawlessness. But that didn't stop Mike and Tom. In their minds, they were establishing order and subduing yet another brazen intruder. When the man was seated in the back seat of the patrol car, he took a deep breath and said again, completely calmly but firmly, "You can call it whatever you want, but what you're doing is a crime. I want to be allowed to contact my lawyer." Mike turned to him with a smirk, thrusting himself up to be face to face. "Listen to me, General," he said with a sneer. "No one can help you here. Not a lawyer, not a rank. You're with us until we decide what to do with you, so you can put the whole town on its ear and no one will hear you." The man did not answer, only turned away, as if he refused to take their words seriously. His silence infuriated them, as if they were facing not a man but a silent wall that their rudeness and threat could not break down. They drove off, taking him to the station. When they arrived at the station, Mike and Tom quickly took the man out of the car and, still pushing him roughly, led him into the building. The policemen at the entrance looked at their prisoner in surprise, but seeing the fierce expression on Mike and Tom's faces, they asked no questions. The man walked straight ahead, not stumbling, his head held high, and his dignity and calmness irritated the officers even more. They took him into the interrogation room, sat him in a hard metal chair, and only then did one of the officers on duty, Jacobs, approach them with the usual procedural request. "We have to have a basis for detention here," he said, glancing at the detainee. "You might want to uncuff him and show some identification. Who is he, anyway?" Mike and Tom looked at each other, as if oblivious to that detail, and reluctantly loosened the handcuffs on the man's wrists. Mike squinted angrily and hissed, "Come on, tell me who you really are," he said, unable to hide his irritation. "You kept saying you had something to show for it." The man calmly pulled his leather wallet out of his pocket, which the police had apparently not noticed or dared to search all the way through. He opened it slowly, pulled out his ID, and placed it on the table in front of Mike, pulling it forward a little. Mike smiled sarcastically and took the ID card, not bothering to look at it closely at first. But as soon as his gaze fell on the crest and rank, his face changed dramatically. He turned pale, unable to believe what he was seeing. On the certificate was clearly written, "Major General Alexei Sergeyevich Vlasov." In small letters beneath the photo was information confirming his high position and long service. Mike froze as if petrified. Feeling his confidence instantly crumble, he turned slowly to Tom, who had already noticed the change in his face. Are you an army general? Mike barely got it out of him, his voice a croak. Exactly, General Vlasov replied coldly, looking at him as if he had already passed judgment on him. This is the second time I've introduced myself to you, but you chose to ignore my words and resort to humiliating treatment like a criminal. Tom snatched the ID card out of Mike's hands and almost dropped it in shock as he looked at it. His face flushed red and his hands trembled. All his self-righteousness, all the cruelty with which he had treated the man, now seemed to him outright insanity. General, this is some kind of misunderstanding, Tom mumbled, stammering, not knowing how to get out of this situation. We were just following protocol. Protocol? The general grinned, but there was so much rage in his eyes that Tom instinctively took a step back. The protocols of your service are violence, threats, and contempt, rude and a violation of my rights. You allowed yourself to treat me with incredible cruelty just because you found me suspicious in your prejudiced opinion? Mike, realizing the situation was taking a threatening turn, tried desperately to soften his tone. General Vlasov, we didn't know who you were. We were just doing our job. He excused himself, feeling his confidence slipping away. It was an accident. General Vlasov rose from his chair without taking his eyes off them, tucking his ID card into his pocket. He looked at them with icy contempt. His face was stern and unyielding, and there was a tension in the air so strong that the other officers froze in the doorway, hesitant to interfere. An accident? He said, looking at each of them individually. Your actions are not an accident. They are the result of your cowardice and hatred. You thought you could do as you pleased to someone you thought was powerless and defenseless. The man paused, enduring the dead silence in the room. With every word he said, the police officers were losing more and more self-control, realizing that the consequences of their actions could come upon them with incredible force. General Vlasov left the station with such unshakable determination that even his stern appearance seemed to leave an imprint on the walls of the interrogation room. A few minutes after his departure, the officers in the station were already discussing what had happened. Whispering apprehensively, they realized that a real threat was hanging over them. Time seemed to slow down, and tension gripped everyone who knew about the incident. The general was not about to leave the matter to chance. The very next day, the police headquarters received an official request from the Ministry of Defense demanding an immediate internal investigation. But Vlasov didn't stop there. He gave an interview to the local news, where he spoke frankly about everything that had happened, not shying away from describing humiliation, aggression, and bias on the part of the police. The news quickly hit the front pages of newspapers and news portals. Army general assaulted and illegally detained by police was the headline in every major publication. Television channels and online news platforms ran special reports discussing the details of the incident and showing footage captured by eyewitnesses on their phones. People who saw police officers roughing up the man recorded video messages and posted them on social media, adding new details to this growing story. The scandal grew rapidly like wildfire. The public was outraged, and thousands of people began to speak out about police brutality and systemic bias. Social media was flooded with hashtags like #JusticeForGeneral and #NoPoliceDisorder. Following this, the prosecutor's office became involved in the investigation and began proceedings to bring the perpetrators to justice. Meanwhile, the police station where Mike and Tom worked became the center of attention. Journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens gathered in front of the station, demanding explanations. The police leadership felt besieged. They had to justify themselves and answer uncomfortable questions about the performance standards of their subordinates. Attempts to evade responsibility only made them worse, and after 2 days they were forced to suspend Mike and Tom from duty to relieve some of the pressure. Mike, sitting at home in anxious anticipation, felt his life falling apart. He turned on the TV and was horrified to see his name in the headlines. While the screen talked about how he and his partner had brutally apprehended a general, he started getting calls from friends and family who were shocked and bewildered. He tried to explain to them that it wasn't like that he was just doing his job, but even those closest to him couldn't hide their disappointment. Meanwhile, General Vlasov assembled a group of lawyers and civil rights specialists with whom he began to prepare a powerful appeal. His goal was clear: to push for police reform so that such incidents could never happen again. In his press statement, he said, "This was not the first case and, unfortunately, not the last. When people who defend our laws, instead of protecting the rights of citizens, are engaged in violating them, we cannot allow such cases to go unpunished. I demand full accountability for everyone who allowed themselves to violate their oath of office and the principles of justice." His every word was met with a storm of applause. He became a symbol of the struggle against police brutality, and even those who had no interest in politics followed his case with intensity. A week later, a press briefing was scheduled, at which the police leadership, backed against the wall, promised a transparent and thorough investigation. But that was not enough for the public. People demanded not just disciplinary action, but an overhaul of the entire system that allowed officers like Mike and Tom to use their power for personal gain. The whole country watched with bated breath as the situation unfolded. Shocking details about the detention of General Vlasov have traveled across the country. The story of a high-ranking officer being subjected to a racist attack by police officers sparked a wave of outrage and caused many to reflect on the deep-rooted problems of bias in law enforcement. News programs and social media made headlines, drawing attention to an issue that has often been glossed over. Experts and analysts joined the discussion, not leaving the actions of police officers without criticism. They examined every detail of the incident, emphasizing that none of the stages of detention had legal grounds. Human rights experts and lawyers emphasized that bias and abuse of power are not uncommon in law enforcement agencies, especially against people of certain ethnic and racial groups. The problem became so acute that the central TV channels organized several major TV debates, inviting both supporters of reforms and those who defended the police. On one side were human rights activists and activists who argued that such cases were just the tip of the iceberg. They argued that bias has become the norm in a police culture dominated by an atmosphere of distrust and often contempt for people of other races. On the other hand, police representatives and conservative organizations tried to justify the officers' actions by citing difficult working conditions. But these excuses sounded less and less convincing amid the scale of the scandal. Particular attention was drawn to the interviews of several former colleagues of Mike and Tom, who, on condition of anonymity, told journalists that their partners had repeatedly found themselves at the center of scandals for their aggressive and rude treatment of suspects. They recalled how they showed blatant disrespect for people of other races, often justifying their actions with stereotypes and their own preconceived notions of typical criminals. One colleague remarked, "It was clear from the very beginning that they did not share the core values and principles of policing. They treated people as inferior. They did not care who they detained. Everyone was an enemy to them." These admissions were another blow to the police department. Public attention was fueled by new facts and witnesses who increasingly spoke of the need to rethink the way police officers were selected and trained. Soon the prosecutor's office decided to deepen the investigation by requesting archives with previous complaints against Mike and Tom, and invited anyone who had information about other instances of their rough treatment of detainees. Public pressure mounted, and soon people took to the streets. Rallies against police violence and racism swept the city. Demonstrators held placards calling for reform, demanding transparency and justice, and demanding that police officers be held truly accountable for their actions. Crowds gathered outside the police station where Mike and Tom served, chanting slogans and demanding punishment for those responsible. Under public and media pressure, the police department was forced to recognize that systemic problems do exist within its ranks. The chief of police issued an official statement recognizing that bias and racism within the department remained a serious problem and pledged to take steps to improve the internal culture and review the training of new officers. Against the backdrop of these events, Mike and Tom became national pariahs. Their names became synonymous with disgrace, and friends and colleagues began to avoid them for fear of ruining their reputations. Mike received several threatening letters in which unknown people warned him that society's patience had run out and that he and his partner would now have to answer for everything. Realizing that he was trapped in a trap he had created himself, Mike felt despair, but there was no way to change anything. Meanwhile, General Vlasov continued to appear in the media, raising more and more questions about incompetence and bias in the police with each interview. He argued that his incident was just the tip of the iceberg, and that many citizens who lacked power and authority suffered daily brutality and injustice that they kept silent about. He was supported by civil society organizations that pushed the authorities to take stronger action. The scandal gained momentum, affecting a wider and wider section of society and causing many to realize that the problems of racism and bias in the police force had become so systemic that simply firing Mike and Tom was no longer enough. Against the background of the growing scandal and unceasing protests, the police department decided to take a desperate step. An official statement apologizing to General Vlasov was published. The police chief personally appeared in front of the cameras. His face seemed haggard and preoccupied, but his attempts to demonstrate sincerity looked clumsy. In a pre-prepared statement, he expressed his deepest regrets about what had happened and promised that there would be a thorough internal investigation into the actions of officers Mike and Tom. We apologize to General Vlasov and assure the public that such incidents will be investigated with the utmost rigor, the police chief said, choosing his words with care, as if he feared that any wrong word might aggravate the situation further. We are fully aware of the importance of citizens' trust in the police and are committed to taking all measures to prevent such incidents in the future. However, the public treated the apology with obvious skepticism. A barrage of criticism began on social media, with people calling the statement empty words, cheap excuses, and an attempt to hush things up. Many noted that this was not the first time that the police promised reforms but failed to take real steps. People were tired of empty words. They demanded actions that would really change the situation. Activists and human rights organizations made a number of demands. They insisted on the dismissal not only of Mike and Tom, but also on the prosecution of their direct supervisors who turned a blind eye to their violations. Moreover, an independent investigation with the participation of public organizations and media representatives was proposed to guarantee the transparency of the process. People understood that the department was in no hurry to put the initiative in the hands of outside observers, fearing that it would reveal more inconvenient facts and systemic problems. Meanwhile, more and more details continued to surface in the press. It became known that Mike and Tom had already received several complaints for aggressive behavior and bias, but none of them had been taken seriously. Reports surfaced that management had repeatedly covered up their misbehavior, preferring to pretend the problem didn't exist. This only increased public anger, with people demanding answers to the question, how could these two men have been able to violate the rights of citizens for so many years with impunity? The authorities were forced to respond. The governor of the state, under pressure from protesters, issued a statement promising that the police system must be reformed from within and assured that an independent investigation would be approved if necessary. His statement was met with mixed reactions. Some people saw it as a real step toward justice, but many remained convinced that the words were just another attempt to cover up the scandal. At this time, General Vlasov was not silent either. He gave several interviews in which he criticized not only Mike and Tom's actions, but also the entire police department, calling it a haven for abuse and bias. He was adamant that simply apologizing was not enough. Empty apologies and promises of an investigation mean nothing if there are no real consequences for the perpetrators and the system that produced them. Vlasov said in his latest interview, "I'm not asking for an apology for myself. I'm asking for justice for all those who suffered the same unpunished brutality. We need real reforms, not just more words." His words spread across social networks and news portals, further fueling the protest mood. Public support for the general grew, and he became something of a symbol of the struggle against police violence and injustice. People recorded video messages in his support, created social media groups, and collected signatures on petitions demanding fundamental changes in the police. A few days passed, and the pressure only increased. Each new news report revealed to the public new details from Mike and Tom's past. It turned out that they had been involved in detentions involving excessive force, and many detainees had no opportunity to file a complaint. The stories of these men who finally dared to speak out about their suffering were amazing. One after another, they came forward with accusations against the police, describing how they had been humiliated and intimidated. In light of these revelations, a simple statement of apology seemed like outright bullying. The day after the police department issued an empty apology, General Vlasov convened a press conference to express his displeasure with what had happened and to strongly voice his position. Once again, the spotlight was on this high-profile case, which has now become not just a personal grievance, but a symbol of much broader and more painful problems related to racism and bias in law enforcement. The general stood before the journalists with a stony expression. He knew that his words could affect many lives, so he chose each word carefully. First of all, he stated that apologies to the police, even if they were sincere, could not be accepted unless real action followed. Vlasov was not going to settle for standard statements and promises to fix the situation. He knew that the problems were much deeper and needed to start at the very root with the education and selection of personnel for the police. Apologies without action are a waste of time. He began. I don't need words. I need real accountability. As a citizen and as a military man, I cannot accept that the police officers we hire to protect our rights and the rule of law can be so indifferent. Their behavior is the result of something bigger, something that cannot continue in this system. We must not only punish those who committed this crime, but we must also take steps to ensure that similar incidents do not occur in the future. His words cut the air, and the journalists instantly began to ask questions, but the general was in no hurry to answer them all. He first focused on his own experience, telling how he had served the country for many years, how he had faced difficulties in the army, but always found respect for himself as a person and a professional, and how stunned he was when he encountered aggression and racism in the most vulnerable yet powerful institution, the police. I served in the army, and honesty, discipline, and respect were always the most important things there. At the front, you don't ask what color a person's skin is. You see him as a soldier, a brother in arms. And suddenly, when I found myself on the street, I was confronted with the fact that those who are supposed to protect are doing the opposite. This aggression, this darkness of prejudice that I experienced firsthand is not an accident. It is the result of an unhealthy, racist culture that exists within the police ranks. The general emphasized that the system requires change, not cosmetic reforms. He called for the establishment of independent commissions to evaluate police performance, ensuring that all complaints against officers would be investigated without bias. He also insisted that police training standards should be reviewed, especially in relation to their interaction with people of different races and ethnic groups. We talk about honesty, about the protection of citizens' rights, but when there are implicit and explicit stereotypes in police stations, when the personnel who are supposed to protect law and order turn out to be the most violent aggressors, we must realize that we cannot continue to live in illusions. He continued, drawing attention to the fact that racism in the police is not an isolated problem, but a systemic disease. We need to change the very foundation of police culture to create an atmosphere where no form of violence, bias, or injustice will be tolerated. These words, full of determination and strength, resonated in the hearts of many. General Vlasov became an increasingly popular figure, not only in military circles, but also in political, social, and human rights spheres. He received support from opinion leaders as well as from individual politicians who began to speak out in favor of early reform of the law enforcement agencies. One senator, seeing the power of the general's speech, suggested that a bill be drafted at the legislative level that would provide more stringent selection and training requirements for police officers. However, Not everyone received his statements with enthusiasm. Military and right-wing politicians began accusing him of undermining the authority of the police and casting a shadow over all law enforcement officers. Some media, traditionally more inclined to support law and order, tried to twist the general's words, claiming that he was demonizing the police and putting pressure on the authorities. They argued that he was using the case for personal gain and political ambitions, exaggerating the scale of the problem. Meanwhile, a real battle of opinions broke out online. Some supported the general, while others accused him of populism and inciting discord. The debate went on for days, and the number of protests and rallies only increased. The general nevertheless continued his campaign for reform. Human rights activists, lawyers, activists, and even some police officers gathered in his camp, ready to work for change from within the system. For Vlasov, the struggle did not end once he was in the spotlight. He knew that the process of change would be long and difficult, but he was willing to go all the way. He realized that the consequences of his actions would be far from immediate, but he also knew that if he did not start reforms now, the situation would only worsen. A few days after General Vlasov's explosive interview, which continued to bubble up on social media and in the news, the police department, under public pressure, finally decided to take a step it had long avoided. It officially announced the start of an internal investigation into the police officers involved in the general's arrest. But instead of being decisive and acting quickly, the process dragged on, and public discontent only grew. The first decision was to suspend police officers Mike and Tom, who directly apprehended the general, as well as several of their colleagues who witnessed the incident. All of them were reassigned to administrative work and barred from performing their duties until the investigation was completed. However, this measure looked more like an attempt to appease the public than a serious punishment. Everyone knew that suspension without real consequences was no more than a formality. The police department's statement, which sounded almost like an apology, sparked another wave of outrage. It said the investigation would be conducted with the utmost transparency and that unwarranted violence and bias within the police force is unacceptable. Within hours, however, media reports began to emerge that a number of Mike and Tom's former colleagues, as well as other police officers, were trying to pressure the investigation by minimizing their culpability and claiming that the officers' actions were a misunderstanding or misinterpretation of the situation. All this led to even greater discontent on the part of activists, human rights organizations, and citizens. They insisted that the investigation should not be conducted internally, but by an independent commission, preferably with the participation of external observers. Some suggested the involvement of independent experts to ensure that the investigation would not be biased and that the perpetrators would be effectively punished. With each passing day, information about the investigation became more and more contradictory. Various sources reported that at least one of the police officers had already expressed his version of events, that allegedly General Vlasov was not recognized and that their actions were justified by fear of the unknown man. This statement was made with such insistence that there was a feeling that the officers were not being sincere, but rather trying to shift the blame to circumstances. But the more questions asked, the more it became clear the police officers had no plan to truly investigate their actions, and their attempts to justify themselves only increased suspicions that the system was corrupt. Meanwhile, General Vlasov continued to be the center of attention. He was supported not only by activists, but also by entire political groups demanding immediate legislation on law enforcement reform. He gave another interview in which he explained that police problems are not only a problem of racism, but also a general issue of lack of control and how often police officers act with impunity without fear of repercussions. Vlasov stated that only a complete rethinking of how the police interact with society can prevent such incidents from recurring. Meanwhile, the police department continued to work on the investigation, but instead of moving forward to find the real culprits, it was as if they were obsessing over the details, trying to exonerate their officers. The contradictions in the officers' testimony became more and more apparent. Mike claimed that he acted according to instructions in a situation where General Vlassov's alleged behavior appeared threatening and that he considered him a dangerous element because he refused to show his documents immediately. However, the general's lawyers and independent experts insisted that this argument was an unjustified fabrication and that the behavior of the police officers was inherently aggressive and racist. In the midst of the investigation, it was revealed that this was not the first time Mike and Tom had shown bias. Testimonies from people who claimed to have been victimized by these officers in the past began appearing on social media. One post that quickly gained popularity was about how Mike and Tom pulled over a woman simply because she was African American and proceeded to accuse her of something that later turned out to be false. This testimony brought even more attention to the investigation. As soon as information about possible violations by police officers hit the public domain, there was a sharp increase in protest actions. People began to take to the streets, demanding real reforms and bringing the perpetrators to justice. While the majority of the public demanded the immediate dismissal of Mike and Tom and the investigation of their colleagues, alarm bells began to go off within the police force that the investigation could drag on for months, if not years. But for most citizens, the case was not limited to just the arrest of the general. In their eyes, it was part of a bigger picture: constant violence, bias and impunity on the part of law enforcement agencies. General Vlassov continued to actively support the protesters, even despite the pressure he felt. He confidently declared that he will not stop until he sees real change. Public tension had reached its peak. A few months after General Vlassov was detained on false charges, the situation in the police department and in society at large underwent dramatic changes. The scandal, which was initially perceived as an incident, soon became a catalyst for systemic reforms in law enforcement that affected not only local governance, but also the behavior of police officers throughout the country. While the road to these changes has been long and thorny, the events have led to one important and inescapable conclusion: racism, bias, and police violence must be eradicated. First, amid pressure from the media, activists, and political figures, the leadership of the police department decided to completely overhaul the training system for its officers. It was announced that all police officers, from rank-and-file officers to supervisory staff, would have to undergo training on racial bias, respect for human rights, and inclusiveness. It was important not only to teach officers to recognize their biases, but also to give them the tools to act according to ethical standards, regardless of personal biases. One of the most important elements of the reforms was the introduction of new criteria for police recruitment, focusing on human qualities rather than just physical fitness or technical skills. They established mandatory testing for candidates for latent racist and aggressive tendencies, and expanded the psychosocial training program. The police could no longer be a closed world. Isolated from society, they had to become a real service for the people. Despite these positive changes, however, the scandal continued to affect the reputation of the police department. Internal divisions among officers became increasingly evident. A certain number of senior officials attempted to sabotage the reforms, claiming that such changes only weakened the police. They argued that slowing down action, exaggerating bias, and universally enforcing tolerance standards would lead to poor performance. However, this view was quickly suppressed when it became clear that the policy of unacceptable racism and violence was supported by the majority of society. General Vlassov, meanwhile, became a symbol of change. His determination to fight for justice inspired thousands of people. His name became associated with ideas about equality and respect for the rights of all citizens, regardless of their racial, ethnic, or social background. But he realized that his role was not limited to his personal story. He demanded reforms that could actually change the system, not just paint it from the outside. He spoke at rallies emphasizing the need for transparency in policing, and even offered his assistance in drafting bills to protect human rights and reform law enforcement. As a result, after several years, the legislative changes began to reflect everyday reality. Police officers began to undergo mandatory extensive training that focused on skills to communicate effectively with citizens, to detect bias, and to understand cultural differences. They were required to adhere to new standards in their interactions with both suspects and victims, and there was strict accountability for violations of these standards. At the same time as reforms in the police ranks, there have been significant changes in legislation. New laws were adopted that increased penalties for racist and discriminatory behavior, both among police officers and in the broader context of public interaction. The authorities introduced programs to restore public confidence in law enforcement by establishing independent monitoring commissions that reviewed police officers' actions, their interactions with citizens, and conducted a review of each incident. However, despite all these efforts, the very scandal of General Vlasov's arrest continued to be a sensitive topic in society. Many felt that police reform was only the first step. Despite the positive changes, the problems with racism in the human rights system remained relevant and required further work. Nevertheless, this incident was a turning point from which it was impossible to return to the previous state of affairs. Public attitudes towards police officers have changed. When these incidents occurred, people no longer saw them as isolated incidents. They knew that it was important to fight for justice and that any case of violence, bias, or discrimination must be exposed and condemned. Although society will not be completely free of these problems for a long time to come, the moment when General Vlasov came into the spotlight was the starting point for a new era of struggle for equality. But Vlasov did not hide behind the title of general. He continued his public activism, demanding further reforms and support for those in difficult circumstances. He knew that real victory lay not only in recognizing one's own innocence, but also in changing the system so that no one else would be the victim of injustice. His story was not only a personal triumph, but a lesson for the entire nation. Thank you for your attention and for letting this story be a part of your day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you again!